Hi, enjoy listening. Madeline Carter didn't cry at the funeral. Not because she wasn't heartbroken. She was. She just didn't have any tears left. The air in the cemetery was thick and motionless, as if even the wind felt sorry for her. The July sun hung low, blazing against the lacquered surface of two side-by-side caskets. Her parents were in there. Just 5 days ago, they'd kissed her goodbye at the airport, promising to call when they landed in France. They never did. She stood alone in her black dress, her hair pinned back the way her mum liked, clutching a damp tissue in one hand and her mother's silk scarf in the other. Everything else, school, friends, birthdays, the dog at home, felt like another life. Someone was talking, but Maddie wasn't listening. The words about peace, eternity, and God's will blurred into background noise. Her eyes locked on the flower arrangements, perfect and stiff, sitting on top of the closed caskets. Closed. The plane had gone down over the southern French countryside during a freak thunderstorm. A private jet, a trusted pilot, a short trip for meetings and museums. And just like that, nothing. Gone. Someone coughed behind her. Poor girl, whispered a woman with a clipboard, probably one of her father's employees. 12 years old and all alone. She's not the only one we should worry about. Another voice cut in. A man, firm and clipped. We've started reviewing the Carter's holdings. It's worse than we thought. The company's barely solvent. Most of the subsidiaries are upside down in debt. The house will need to be sold. What about her guardianship? The woman asked softly. Relatives were contacted. None have agreed to take her. No surprise there. Maddie didn't turn around, but her jaw clenched. She knew that voice. It belonged to Mr. Beck, her father's lead financial officer. He used to bring her cinnamon scones when she visited the office. Without a legal guardian, she'll be placed in temporary care, Beck said flatly. The firm's legal team is withdrawing from the estate proceedings. We can't protect assets that don't exist. That was when it hit her. The full weight of it. Her parents were dead. The house was gone. No one was coming. She stared at the caskets and felt something inside her go hollow. An older woman, a stranger with a church name tag, touched Maddie's shoulder. Sweetheart, would you like to say goodbye? Maddie didn't answer. She just shook her head. The caskets began to lower into the ground. As the dirt began to fall, Maddie's lips parted slightly. She wanted to scream, to throw herself on the caskets, to rewind time. But she just stood there, frozen. Hours later, after most people had left, and the caterers were cleaning up untouched food from the post-funeral gathering, 2 women from the county's Division of Child Services approached her with sympathetic smiles and manila folders. You can take some of your personal items, one said gently. We'll get you settled tonight. Settled She hated that word. Settled meant temporary. Settled meant whatever bed was available. Settled meant her whole world was being crammed into a suitcase and shoved in the back seat of a government car. No one asked what she wanted. No one asked where she was going. Maddie was seated in the back of a dark sedan with tinted windows, driving away from the only home she had ever known, clutching her mother's scarf like a lifeline. The house she had left behind was probably already being inventoried. As the car pulled onto the highway, she finally allowed one tear to escape. Just one. But it carried the weight of everything. The foster home didn't look like the worst place in the world, at least not from the outside. A 2-story house on a corner lot in Akron, Ohio. Faded blue siding, overgrown hedges, a broken swing on the front porch. It had once been someone's dream. Now it looked like it had stopped dreaming altogether. Madeline stood on the cracked walkway with her suitcase beside her, heart pounding. The woman who had driven her, Miss Kersey, knocked twice before the door swung open. "You must be Maddie," said the woman inside. A tall, square-jawed lady in her 50s, with a clipboard and a cigarette behind one ear. "Name's Mrs. Cutler. Rules are simple. You don't run, you don't steal, and you don't start fights. The rest we'll work out." She turned and walked inside, expecting Maddie to follow. The house smelled like reheated pasta and mildew. A half-dozen kids of varying ages sat on a tattered couch watching a cartoon with the volume too loud. Her room was cramped and plain. Posters of boy bands and fashion models were taped to the walls. The other girls were already inside, both older, maybe 15 or 16. They didn't say hello. "Hey," one of them said finally. "You're the rich girl, right? With the plane crash?" Maddie's stomach twisted. The other girl laughed. "Bet you thought you'd end up with your own trust fund and a penthouse. Surprise. Welcome to real life." That night, Maddie laid in the top bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to one of the girls snore below. Her suitcase sat at the foot of her bed, unopened. She was too tired to cry and too angry to sleep. At breakfast the next morning, she sat quietly with her bowl of cereal, ignoring the elbow jabs and whispered remarks. One kid deliberately knocked over her milk, calling it an accident. No one stopped him. Maddie kept her head down. The worst part wasn't the bullying. It wasn't the tasteless food, the cold showers, or even the dirty looks. It was the emptiness. At home, there had always been warmth, fresh bread, jazz music playing in the kitchen, her mother humming. Here, there was only noise, laughter that sounded hollow, yelling behind closed doors. At school, things weren't much better. Her records had been hastily transferred, and her classmates whispered like she couldn't hear them. "That's the orphan girl. Her parents crashed in a jet. Bet she used to have a pony." Maddie didn't have the energy to correct them. One afternoon, after school, she found a quiet spot in the public library. She didn't read. She just sat, thinking, remembering, trying to hold on to something that felt like her. And that's where Tessa Bloom first approached her. Tessa wasn't dressed like a social worker. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, her curly auburn hair pinned back with a pencil. She had a softness about her, not pity, but patience. "You Maddie Carter?" she asked gently. Maddie eyed her warily. "Who wants to know?" "I'm your new caseworker," Tessa said, sitting across from her. "Heard a lot about you." "Let me guess. I'm difficult." Tessa smiled. "That's what they said, but I don't believe everything I hear." Maddie raised an eyebrow. "Look," Tessa continued, "I've seen enough to know this place isn't easy. But you've got more grit than most kids twice your age. And I'm not going to let you fall through the cracks. Not on my watch." Maddie didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. Over the next few months, Tessa kept showing up. She bought notebooks, snacks, clothes that actually fit. She talked to teachers. She argued with Cutler. She pushed back against the system. And Maddie slowly let her in. She still had bad days. Nights when she couldn't sleep. Days when the weight of everything was too much. But she wasn't alone anymore. Once, after a particularly awful argument with another foster girl, Maddie sat outside on the back steps, her hands trembling. "Do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" "No," Tessa said. "I think you'll feel stronger." Madeline Carter turned 18 on a Wednesday. No cake, no candles. Just a slightly crumpled birthday card from Tessa, tucked under her door that morning with a note. "One more step forward. I'm proud of you. T." She kept the card in her jacket pocket all day. By then, Maddie had learned how to move through the world quietly. She kept her head down at school, avoided drama in the foster home, and worked late shifts at a discount shoe store for minimum wage. Most of her paycheck went into a savings account Tessa had helped her open. She didn't spend much, only what was absolutely necessary. She had one goal: freedom. And it came, slowly but surely. 3 weeks after her birthday, Tessa pulled up outside the foster house in her dusty Subaru, the trunk stuffed with boxes, cleaning supplies, and a second-hand toaster. Maddie was already waiting on the curb, suitcase in hand, her face unreadable. "You ready?" Tessa asked. "I've been ready for 6 years," Maddie said. The apartment was nothing special. Just a studio on the second floor of a boxy brick building in an aging part of town. The hallway smelled like bleach and microwave dinners. The elevator was broken. But the rent was covered for the first 3 months through a state transition grant, and Maddie qualified for reduced tuition at the local community college. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. Maddie stood in the middle of the empty room, For a long time. One window, one radiator, one creaky bed against the far wall. A tiny kitchenette with old white cabinets and a fridge that hummed like it might take flight. Tessa set a stack of towels on the counter and turned to her. "You okay?" Maddie nodded, but her eyes shimmered. "This is mine." "All yours." She didn't cry until Tessa left. She didn't sob or break down, just stood by the window, forehead against the cool glass, and let the tears come. Quiet, grateful ones. Later, she unpacked methodically, placing her few clothes in the narrow closet, setting her mother's scarf in the top drawer. She taped the birthday card to the fridge. It was the only thing on it. That night, she made boxed mac and cheese on the stove, sitting on the floor to eat. There was no furniture yet, not even a chair. But she didn't care. For the first time in years, she wasn't listening for other people's voices. She wasn't afraid of sudden shouting, or someone barging in, or being told to move. There was no one to tell her anything, just the low buzz of the fridge and the occasional creak of the pipes. She smiled to herself. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Maddie enrolled in classes, Intro to Psychology, college writing, and a general education math class she already hated. She worked evenings at a local diner, bussing tables. The tips were terrible, but the hours were steady. It was exhausting, but she had never felt more alive. She started waking up early just to make coffee and sit by the window, watching the city wake up. She listened to podcasts about budgeting and personal growth. She took long walks with no destination, just because she could. And every Sunday, without fail, Tessa came by. Sometimes she bought groceries, sometimes just herself and 2 paper cups of tea. They'd talk about classes, work, life. It wasn't mother-daughter. It wasn't therapist-patient. It was something else. Something steady. One Sunday afternoon, they sat on a cheap rug Maddie had found at a yard sale. The room was still mostly empty, but now she had a chair, a lamp, and a plant named Winston that she watered religiously. "You're doing it," Tessa said, sipping her tea. "Doing what?" "Building a life." Maddie stared at the chipped paint on the far wall. "Some days I still feel like I'm waiting for it to be taken away." Tessa nodded. "I used to feel like that too." Maddie glanced at her. "When does it stop?" Tessa gave a half smile. "It doesn't. Not entirely. But one day, you'll stop expecting the worst and start believing you deserve the best." Maddie looked down at her tea, letting the words soak in. Then she said something she hadn't told anyone since her parents died. "I want to own something, someday. Not just rent a space in someone else's life. I want to have a place that's mine. Really mine." Tessa clinked her cup against Maddie's. "Then let's build toward that." And they did. Together, brick by emotional brick. It started with an envelope. No return address. No markings, just her name, handwritten in soft blue ink. Madeline Carter. She found it late one afternoon, wedged beneath her apartment door, like an afterthought. It wasn't from Tessa. Tessa always texted before dropping anything off. It wasn't a bill either. Those came digitally, and the handwriting didn't match anyone she knew. Maddie sat on her bed, the envelope resting in her lap, unopened for nearly half an hour. She didn't trust surprises, not anymore. Finally, she tore it open. Inside was a simple letter, printed on heavy stationery, with words that made her entire world tilt sideways. Dear Miss Carter, I am writing on behalf of the estate of Judith Evelyn Mercer, a former associate of your late mother, Leela Carter, in accordance with the final wishes of Miss Mercer, and in recognition of a private arrangement made many years ago between herself and your parents. You are named as the sole beneficiary of her personal residence and property located in Harbour, Maine. Enclosed, you will find a copy of the legal deed, a contact card for the local probate attorney, and a key. We understand that this news may come as a surprise and are available to provide support and guidance should you choose to visit the property or assume ownership. Sincerely, Annika Sloan, Estate Liaison. Maddie sat there, blinking. Harbour, Maine? She'd never heard of it. She pulled out the second sheet, a copy of the deed. Sure enough, her name was printed neatly at the top. Madeline Rose Carter, along with the address, 112 Driftwood Lane. Then the key. It was old and heavy, brass, with a worn tag attached. Front door. She stared at it, like it might vanish. A house. A house. Not just a room or a rental or a storage closet behind a diner. A real place, with windows and light and a past. And it was hers. The next morning, Tessa came over and found Maddie pacing the living room, holding the envelope like it was radioactive. Read this, Maddie said, shoving it into her hands. Tell me I'm not hallucinating. Tessa read the letter twice. This woman, Judith Mercer, do you know who she was? She asked. Maddie shook her head. No, but apparently she knew my mum. Tessa looked thoughtful. It's not unheard of. Wealthy benefactors sometimes make private agreements. But this? It's big. It feels weird, Maddie admitted. Like it can't be real. Tessa sat down slowly. You don't have to decide anything yet. But if it's legitimate, and it looks like it is, this could be a fresh start. Maddie walked to the window, rubbing the key between her fingers. That's the part that scares me. Why? Because part of me wants it too much, and I don't know what to do with something I didn't have to fight for. Tessa stood and gently touched her arm. Maybe this is the world giving something back. Maddie said nothing, but later that evening, she pulled out her laptop and searched for Harbour, Maine. It was a small coastal town, barely a dot on the map, nestled against a jagged shoreline, surrounded by pine forests and old colonial houses. Population just under 2,000. One grocery store. It was exactly what she hadn't expected. White clapboard siding, dark green shutters, a wraparound porch with peeling paint, and wild seagrass that had overtaken the fence. It looked like it had been asleep for years. But it was beautiful, in the way forgotten places sometimes are. Quiet, stubborn, still standing. She stood on the porch with the brass key in her hand, her heart thudding. And then she opened the door. The scent of dust and old wood rushed out to greet her. The foyer was dim and creaky, but full of light filtering through lace curtains. A grandfather clock stood in the hallway, frozen at 2:13. A staircase curled upward like a question mark. Everything looked untouched, but waiting. She stepped inside and whispered aloud, "Hello?" No answer. Of course not. It was hers now. And for the first time since she was 12 years old, Maddie felt something close to home. Not a perfect one. Not one without ghosts. But one where the light could finally come in. The house was quiet in a way that made her listen. Not for danger. There was no danger here. But for history. For breath left behind in the walls. For old laughter trapped in floorboards. For memories that weren't hers. Maddie spent her first night in Harbour, Maine, on a borrowed mattress in the living room, wrapped in a thick quilt she'd found in a cedar chest upstairs. The power had been turned off for years, and the plumbing was questionable at best. But the fireplace worked, and she had matches. She lit a small fire and sat cross-legged in front of it, arms around her knees, the house groaning softly with the wind. Some people would have called it haunted. Maddie called it honest. By morning, sunlight spilled in through the salt-streaked windows and painted the wood floors gold. She opened the back door to the porch and inhaled the ocean. Sharp, clean, and impossibly alive. She made a list. Call electrician, check plumbing, grocery store, clean out fridge. Pray nothing's alive in there. Find out who Judith Mercer was. She started with the fridge. It smelled like despair and forgotten mustard. Then she attacked the dust, room by room, hour by hour. It was meditative, almost holy, this act of reclaiming something that had been asleep. And all the while, Maddie kept thinking about the woman who had left it to her. Judith Evelyn Mercer. A name her mother had never spoken, at least not in ways Maddie could recall. Who was she? A friend? A secret relative? On the third day, while exploring the upstairs study, she found a photo. It had slipped behind a bookshelf, and when she pulled it free, the frame was cracked but intact. In it stood her mother, young, maybe in her late 20s, laughing in a sundress, beside an older woman in a wide-brimmed hat. They were standing on the same porch Maddie now called her own. She sat down hard, the picture trembling in her hands. Her mum had been here. This place wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. This house, this town, had been part of her mother's life. A piece Maddie had never been told about. Why? She didn't have an answer, but she knew where to start. The Harbour Town Library sat across from a small square with a fountain shaped like a whale. It smelled like lemon polish and old paper. A thin woman with a high bun and a name tag that read Bev greeted her with a nod. "Mercer?" Bev repeated. "Oh, sure. Judith Mercer lived up on Driftwood Lane. She was a recluse the last decade or so. Died last winter. Stroke." "Did she ever have family?" Maddie asked, trying not to sound desperate. Bev leaned on the counter. "Nope, never married. Taught piano for a while, I think. But back in the 80s, oh, she was something else. Smart, sharp, and very private. People said she used to travel with a younger woman for a while, but no one ever knew who she was." Maddie swallowed. "A younger woman?" "Yeah, photographer maybe. Blonde, I think. They were close. Then one day the girl was just gone. Her mother. It had to be." Maddie wandered through the local archives for hours after that, tracing newspaper clippings and yellowed articles. There was a concert program with Judith Mercer's name listed as pianist, an art fair flyer with a photo credit, Lila Carter, a grainy image of her mother's unmistakable smile. She left the library with a folder full of copied clippings and a head full of questions. That night, she called Tessa. "You won't believe this," Maddie said as she paced the upstairs hallway. "My mum knew her, knew Judith. There are pictures, articles. She lived here. They were together." There was a pause. "You mean romantically?" I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe just best friends. I'm still piecing it together. But it wasn't random. This house, this gift, was part of something bigger." Tessa exhaled. "How are you feeling about it?" Maddie paused at the window, looking out at the sea. Dark blue and pulsing like a secret. "I feel like I'm walking into a story that was left unfinished. And maybe now, I get to finish it." A week later, she was scrubbing the study floor when someone knocked at the front door. Maddie frowned. No one ever knocked. She hadn't told anyone in town who she was. She brushed her hair back, wiped her hands on her jeans, and opened it. A man stood on the porch. Late 20s, shaggy dark hair, salt-dusted coat, and eyes that immediately sparked recognition. "Hi," he said. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Eli. I live 2 doors down. My aunt used to take care of Judith Mercer's garden before she passed." Maddie nodded, unsure what to say. "I heard someone moved in," he continued. "Didn't think anyone would take the place, but I'm glad you did." "Thanks," Maddie said, still cautious. "I'm Maddie." "I figured," he said with a crooked smile. Judith used to talk about you sometimes. Said she hoped you'd come find the house someday. Maddie's heart jumped. She talked about me? Eli nodded. Said you had your mother's eyes. He shifted his weight. Anyway, I brought this. He held up a small paper bag. Lobster rolls. Welcome to Maine. She took it, still stunned. Thanks. He was already walking back down the porch when he turned and added, If you ever need help fixing up the place, I'm pretty handy. Just knock. Maddie watched him disappear down the drive. She looked down at the bag in her hands. For the first time in years, someone had come to her door, not to take something, not to lecture or interrogate, but simply to welcome her. It felt like another key had been handed to her. Not to a house, to a life. The next morning, Maddie woke early. For once, not from a nightmare or a storm of thoughts, but from something gentler, something that felt like belonging. She made coffee with a battered French press she'd found buried in a kitchen cabinet. The house still had no internet and spotty cell service, but it was growing on her. This slow, unplugged rhythm. Like the town breathed differently, on a quieter wavelength. She sat at the kitchen table with the folder of clippings from the library, tracing each photo with her finger. Her mother appeared again and again, always behind the camera, but sometimes caught laughing on the edges of group shots, or reflected in a storefront window, her smile half-captured and unmistakable. Then there was one photo that stopped her cold. It was tucked behind an old Harbour Beacon article about the annual Lighthouse Festival. The caption read, Local pianist Judith Mercer and companion, 1987. In the black and white image, Judith stood beside a woman in a denim jacket. The woman's hand was lightly resting on Judith's shoulder, head turned away from the camera, just enough that only a partial profile could be seen. But Maddie knew it was her mother, even from the angle. Even without a full face, she could tell by the slope of her jaw, the familiar curl of her hair. It was Lila, younger, freer, and unmistakably close to Judith, in a way that wasn't just friendly. She remembered a conversation from years ago. Maddie had asked her mum, when she was maybe 12, if she had ever been in love before her dad. Lila had laughed quietly and said, once, a long time ago, but that wasn't the kind of love I could keep. Maddie had never understood what that meant. Until now. She placed the photo carefully beside her coffee cup. The house around her felt suddenly more intimate, as though the walls had been listening the whole time and were only now exhaling. Later that afternoon, Eli showed up again. This time, he brought a toolbox and a 6-pack of old-fashioned root beer. Don't mind me, he said, brushing past her into the foyer, like he'd lived there once. Figured I'd take a look at that attic light you said was flickering. She hadn't, but she didn't argue. He climbed the narrow stairs to the attic while Maddie followed. The space was wide, with sloped ceilings and dusty trunks lining the edges. One window overlooked the sea. The glass was cracked, but still clung to light like a prism. Eli adjusted the bulb, replaced the wiring, and stepped down from the ladder, brushing dust from his sleeves. "This place has bones," he said, looking around. "Good ones." Maddie gave a small smile. "I think it's got ghosts too." He paused. "Bad kind or good?" "I'm not sure yet." They sat cross-legged on the old floorboards, the window casting crooked shadows between them. "Judith was kind to me," Eli said after a while. "When I was a kid, I'd come mow her lawn or fix her fence, and she'd always give me these weird stories, made-up stuff. Said the house used to be a boarding school for girls in the 1920s. Maddie laughed. Was she serious? Who knows? That she liked the idea of secrets. I think she lived with one for a long time. Maddie nodded slowly. I think my mother did too. She told him about the photo, about Lila, about how nothing had ever added up back then. But now pieces were falling into place and leading her straight into questions she wasn't sure how to answer. Eli listened without interrupting, just resting his elbows on his knees, eyes thoughtful. I think she left this house for you for a reason, he finally said. Maybe not to give you answers, but to let you find them. They sat a little longer in silence, listening to the wind move through the pine trees. Then Eli stood. Come by my place tomorrow. I've got something you should see. What is it? He just smiled. Not telling. You'll see. That night, Maddie wandered the halls of the house, barefoot, a candle in her hand, like she was trying to chase shadows out of corners. She paused in the study, her mother's face still watching her from the edge of a photograph. There were so many things she didn't know, but something had shifted. This place wasn't just a mystery or a gift. It was an inheritance of memory, of two women who had loved and lost quietly, who had carved out a private world between piano keys and shutter clicks, and who had, for reasons she was only beginning to grasp, left it to her, not to erase the past, but to rewrite it in light. The next morning, Maddie walked down Driftwood Lane, the sky wrapped in a mist that turned everything silver. Eli's house sat low and weathered at the end of the road, with a green canoe strapped to the side and wind chimes made of spoons hanging from the porch. He was already outside, kneeling in the grass beside a wooden crate full of old records and photo albums. I went digging in my aunt's attic last night, he said as she approached. She was Judith's closest friend near the end. Thought there might be something worth finding. He gestured to the crate. Go ahead. Maddie knelt, lifting a dust-covered album from the top. It wasn't labelled, but when she opened the cover, a single name had been handwritten on the inside, in elegant ink. Leela. She blinked, then turned the page. Inside were dozens of photographs, some printed, Others developed on thick matte paper, many with small notations in the corner, all taken by her mother. She moved carefully through the pages. There were shots of coastal Maine, tide pools, fog rolling over the harbour, tiny churches on wind-swept hills. Then the subjects changed. Judith seated at a piano. Judith laughing behind a teacup. Judith standing in the doorway of the very house Maddie now lived in, arms folded, eyes shining. She found a photo of her mother, younger than Maddie had ever seen her, lying barefoot in the grass, a camera resting on her chest. Eyes closed, like she was dreaming something too big to hold. Maddie swallowed hard. These weren't just art. They were a life, shared, private, and almost entirely erased from everything that came after. "Your mum was good," Eli said quietly beside her. "Really good. My aunt had some of her photos framed. She said Judith thought Lila could have shown at galleries if she'd stayed." "She didn't," Maddie said, brushing her fingers over the corner of a picture. "She left and never talked about it again." Eli hesitated. "You think she was ashamed?" Maddie shook her head. "No, I think she was afraid. Afraid of how complicated it all was. Afraid of how it would change her future, maybe change me." She sat back on her heels. "But I wish she'd told me. I wish I could have known this part of her." Eli didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached into the crate and pulled out a sealed envelope, faded and yellowed with age. "This was tucked into the back of the album," he said. "It's addressed to you." Maddie stared at the handwriting. "To Madison, when you're ready, J." Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single-page letter, written in Judith's graceful script. "My dear Maddie, if you're reading this, then the house has found its way to you. I never believed in fate, but I always believed in timing. Yours, I trust, is perfect. Your mother loved this place. She found herself here once, just as I hope you will now. She was magic with a camera, and full of a fire that the world sometimes asked her to put out. But not here. Here she was whole. I don't expect you to understand all of it at once. Just know this house is more than walls. It holds pieces of her, of me, of what we were brave enough to be, even if only for a while. Use it well. Fill it with music. Fill it with light. Let it become yours and hers, in whatever way feels right. With all my love, Judith." Maddie read the letter 3 times. Her cheeks were wet before she realized she'd crying. Eli stayed silent beside her, respectful, present. When she finally looked up, the mist had burned off, and the morning sun broke through the clouds like a promise. She folded the letter, held it to her chest. "I think I'm going to stay," she said, her voice soft but certain. Eli smiled, his eyes kind. "Good." That evening, Maddie returned home with the photo album tucked carefully in her bag. She opened all the windows and let the breeze sweep through the rooms. Then she brought the old upright piano in the corner of the living room back to life, one dusty key at a time. She wasn't much of a player, but she remembered a lullaby her mother used to hum when she was small. Soft and slow, full of aching sweetness. She played it, and then she played it again. Outside, the sky turned orange. The sea breathed its eternal rhythm. Inside, Maddie sat at the piano, the album open beside her. The house no longer silent. It had been waiting for her, and now it had begun to speak. In the days that followed, something inside Maddie shifted. Not all at once, not in some grand sweeping moment, but slowly, like the way morning sunlight seeps into a dark room, quiet and steady, until suddenly you realize you're not standing in the dark anymore. She woke early, took long walks through the pine trails that wove behind the property, let the sea wind tangle her hair, ate dinner barefoot on the porch. She started hanging her mother's photos on the walls. At first just one, then another, then 3 in the hallway, then an entire wall in the study. Portraits of harbour in the 80s, women in long skirts, laughing under grey skies, harbour boats caught mid-tide. The house began to change with her. It no longer felt like someone else's gift. It felt like an extension of her mother's voice, preserved in light and shadow. And she started to hear her own voice in the echo. It was on a Friday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, that Maddie walked into the Green Finch, Harbour's antique shop. It was run by a woman named Marigold, who wore oversized glasses and smelled faintly of cedar and cloves. She had a cat named Spooner, who roamed the aisles like he owned the place. "You're Judith's girl," Marigold said, the moment Maddie stepped in, her tone gentle and knowing. "I guess so," Maddie replied. Marigold nodded toward a glass case near the back. "She left something here for you. Told me not to hand it over until you'd been in town for more than a moon cycle." Maddie blinked. "She said that?" Marigold smiled. Judith loved her symbols. Inside the case was a small wooden box. Maddie opened it carefully. Inside was a necklace, a delicate chain with a tiny silver key on the end. Not a house key. It looked old, almost ornamental, like something from a music box. And beneath it, folded neatly, was a note. "To open the smallest door, you have to be the one who listens. Not just hears, listens." Marigold crossed her arms. "You know what it opens?" "No idea," Maddie said, turning the key over in her fingers. "But I think I'm supposed to find it." That night, the rain rolled in. It started as a whisper, then grew into a full storm, the kind that rattled window panes and made the old porch groan. Maddie lit every candle she could find. She curled up in the study, Judith's records playing on the old turntable, bluesy piano, soft and haunting. She wore the key around her neck, like a question waiting to be answered. She thought she might feel scared in the storm, but instead she felt grounded, safe somehow. At one point, and that's when she noticed it. A panel in the upstairs hallway wall, just behind the bookshelf, was slightly ajar. She didn't remember it being open before. Slowly, she walked over, heart thudding. Inside was a small hidden cupboard, and inside that, a worn leather notebook, a faded photo strip of Lila and Judith laughing in a photo booth, and a locked velvet box with a keyhole, just the size of the silver key around her neck. She swallowed, then slid the key in. Click. The lock gave way. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all written in her mother's handwriting. They were addressed to Judith. Some had never been sent. Others had return addresses scratched out. And tucked between them was a final one, written to her. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, but she didn't open it yet. She sat down on the hallway floor, box in her lap, light streaming in through the rain-streaked window. And for the first time in her life, Maddie felt like she was finally, truly about to meet her mother. Not the version she'd grown up with, not the woman edited by grief or time, but the girl in the photograph, the one who had loved and been loved, the one who had left behind more than memories. She had left the truth, and Maddie was ready to read it. Maddie waited until the sun was high and warm on the hallway floor before opening the letter addressed to her. The paper was soft from age, but her mother's handwriting was steady, clear. Maddie recognized it instantly, not just in shape, but in voice. There was something so familiar in it that it brought tears to her eyes before she even read the first line. My Maddie, I don't know how old you'll be when you read this. I don't know where you'll be in your life, what you'll love, or what you'll be searching for. But I trust somehow you'll find this when you're meant to. There are pieces of me you never knew, not because I didn't want you to know them, but because I didn't know how to explain them when you were little. And later, I was afraid. Afraid that the life I had before you would confuse or hurt you, but you are stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I see that now, and I wish I had said all of this out loud while I still had the chance. Before I met your father, I loved someone else. Her name was Judith. We met in this house. We made music and photographs and memories that felt like breathing. It was the first time I ever understood what it meant to be seen fully and still loved. We weren't perfect. We made mistakes, and we couldn't make it last forever. But it was real. When I left, it wasn't because I stopped loving her. It was because I didn't know how to live in a world that didn't give women like us room to stay. It was easier to step into a life that people understood, a life that gave you to me. But I never stopped carrying that part of myself. Judith never let me forget it, even when we lost touch. She gave me this house again, years later, when she was ill, told me to give it to you when the time was right. And I know it's right now. You are the light that came out of a love I couldn't name. You are the reason I believe things don't have to be hidden anymore. Whatever you choose to be, whoever you choose to love, wherever you choose to go, don't hide, don't shrink, don't live in halves. This house is yours now, and with it, all the truth I never had the courage to speak. I hope it sets you free. I love you more than words can say. Always, Mum. By the time Maddie finished reading, the whole world felt still. The wind paused. The light through the windows turned soft and golden. She pressed the letter to her heart and whispered, "I love you too." Over the next few days, Maddie read every letter in the velvet box. She cried. She laughed. She wrote notes in the margins, talked to her mother like she could still hear her. Maybe she could. Then one morning, she drove to the edge of the harbour with a framed photo of Leela and Judith and a thermos of tea. She sat on a rock and watched the tide roll in. And when Eli showed up, as he always seemed to when she needed him, she didn't say anything for a while, just handed him the photo. "She was so much more than I ever knew," she said softly. "You are too," he replied. They didn't need more words than that. In the fall, Maddie opened the front doors of the old house to the public for the first time in decades. She called it the Lighthouse, part gallery, part music space, part storytelling archive. A place where memory and art could live side by side. She hung her mother's photos, put out Judith's journals, played vinyl records in the study. People came, and they kept coming. Locals brought in their own old photographs to share. Tourists wandered in and stayed longer than they meant to. A woman from Portland wept in front of a print of Judith at the piano. "It feels like love," she whispered. Maddie nodded. That's what it was. 1 year later, Maddie sat at the piano in the living room. Outside, the ocean glowed under a pink summer sky. Inside, the house hummed with quiet life. Open windows, flowers on the sill, faint laughter from the porch. She wore the silver key around her neck still, not because she needed it anymore, but because it reminded her of how far she'd come. She'd found more than a house. She'd found her mother. She'd found herself. She played a chord, soft and steady, then turned toward the window, where the light had just begun to spill in golden and warm. And for the first time in her life, Maddie felt whole. If you like the story, I would be very happy to have your support. Click the thumbs up. And to not miss new stories, subscribe and click on the bell. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and all the best.